So we're going to start blocking in the basic shapes, and I'm using white to start with my sky and adding in a little bit of that blue, ultramarine blue, and getting and black to get sort of a gray, moody sky in here. So I'm taking time to mix the colors and blocking in the colors that I want to use. So I'm painting directly. I'm not thinking about glazing, though you can always glaze later. I'm thinking about the colors I want, matching them to my photo or making them darker or lighter, depending on what I want the mood of my painting to be. So I like to mix a couple different variations of grays and add a little bit of blue in there, just because this sky is like a stormy sky and I want it to be really dramatic. So I'm starting with the sky. I usually work from like the background to the middle ground to the foreground and do the foreground last, because to get that atmospheric perspective, the background is going to be the least detailed. So I'm working from least to most detailed. The foreground is going to be closest to us and have the most detail to give that sense of atmospheric perspective. Also, it's sometimes just easier to paint the background and then you can paint the foreground things over it. Like, for example, there's a lot of thin branches in the foreground of this painting of the tree in the foreground, and I need to get the sky behind that and let it dry before I paint those branches on top of it. So I'm always thinking about values and value balance. And I'm not using a lot of color here in the background, so that's another good place to start, to think about the contrast between dark and light. And I'm looking at my photo, but I'm also simplifying it. You know, clouds and water can be really tricky, and take a lot of practice to learn how to paint. So you can simplify it as much as you want. My general idea here is that I'm going to block in the entire sky pretty loosely. I probably could be using a bigger brush, and you can use a bigger brush if you want, but I'm going to get in the general values, the darks and lights, and create contrast in the entire sky while the paint is wet, so I can sort of blend it in, and then I can always go back and add more detail. So this first in progress, first layer of painting is really about blocking in your values and colors. And so I'm over here in the corner and it's getting darker, and I can just kind of fill that in. And you know, when you're doing landscapes and you have trees or things like this with holes in it, right? That tree on the right has the sky showing through. So I'm painting sort of blobs of sky showing through while I'm putting the background in. So I'm getting that tone, that value and color down behind the tree. And I'm going, oh, I know I'm going to go over it with the leaves. So I could paint the entire background and then just go over it with the leaves. But in my mind, I kind of like to think about the design of the composition and where I want those openings of the sky to be. That's a really personal choice. You know, you can fill in the whole thing with one color behind something like that if you have trees or any other elements that things like sky or grass or anything might be showing through. You can just do a solid color behind it and paint over it, or you can start thinking about your composition and where those things might be showing through. And so I'm not thinking about detail yet. I'm thinking about balancing the darks and lights, and I'm thinking about, you know, as quickly as I can. I'm not the quickest painter, but I'm thinking about quickly getting down, blocking in my values and colors. And I'm blending as I go, and I'm really wanting to make this area above the mountain like a focal point. So I am thinking, since I've drawn this composition and I've practiced painting it before, I am thinking about where I want my focal point in my composition to be, and this sort of like highlight in the clouds is a place I want to focus on. So I am already thinking about the final product, but I'm not spending too much time developing that. And then I'm doing the thing we've been doing, which is going over the edges. So I know where this top of the mountain and the horizon and everything will be, and I'm painting my sky a little bit over that edge, and then I'll be painting the mountain back over the sky. You don't want to leave the canvas showing through unless that's something you want to do. Some artists do leave some of the canvas color showing through, so that is of course your choice, but I do think it looks more realistic when you overlap the edges between something like the sky and the object. It places that object in the scene and in the sky there, so there's no separation. So I'm painting over the edges of my drawing, and I'm not being super detailed or careful. I'm even just like wiping off the edges of my brush here to get more paint down. And I'm really just filling in this space with paint. And I'm also defining the composition as I go in a loose way. I am thinking about sort of the outlines and the shapes of the areas I'm filling in, but I'm just not being super, super detailed yet. I'm thinking about what the values are as I get close to the mountain, and then as I move away up into the top layer of the sky. So thinking about what I observed when I went to this place and what I observe in the photo, and then, simplifying it, because you can't paint every detail, and we're not doing photorealistic painting, and the photo already exists. So I think, I like paintings that look like paintings. It's painterly. We see that it's a painting. Someone made it by hand, and I think that's, the beauty of painting. It's not made by a machine. It's not a photo. It's something you created. And now I'm being sure to get that contrast. I think I got a little bit too light with some of these colors, so I'm getting some darker tones up here. And I do this where I wipe my brush off, just because there'll be sometimes a lot of paint buildup, and when I'm filling up a big space like this, I'll just wipe the side of my brush and fill it in. So over here, behind these thin branches, I really want to get the sky complete, and I'm overlapping the trunk of the tree, making sure I'm adding the variation and values, and so that it looks seamless when it goes from one side of the tree to the other. If you painted the branches first and then tried to paint the sky in between the branches, that would be really difficult to do. So I'm just always, mixing new colors, getting these darks and lights, and I'm making a gray with a little ultramarine blue in it. And we can see when we're thinking about color interactions, it's not showing up as a lot of contrast against my background, but there is enough contrast where I can make the darks and the lights pop out. And now I'm just adding a little more texture and dark values into this background around the tree, and I'm making sure I'm getting on both sides of the tree so it looks like, the same sky. It doesn't look broken up by the tree. It looks like we don't want the background to be too detailed, because we want it to fade into the background, right? We want the stuff in the foreground to be more detailed and pop forward to get that atmospheric or aerial perspective that gives the illusion of depth, gives the illusion of 3 dimensions and depth on this 2-dimensional surface of the canvas. So, sometimes I'm spending a little too long on the sky, but I can't help it sometimes. And I do want to get things blended in while the paint is still wet. So I'm, just getting my darks and lights in here. And I'm thinking about the big clouds are difficult. And obviously there's so many different kinds of clouds. So I'm thinking about the sort of bigger shapes that these clouds are creating, and then where that highlight is going to be, and making sure that there's enough dark values to make that highlight pop. And now I'm going back in with some lighter values, just sort of making sure I'm lightening that up again because it kind of got lost where that highlight is. So these brush strokes are just kind of like short, um, almost like U shaped, like the letter U for umbrella or unicorn shaped. And I'm also like dabbing when the paint is wet and you want to add a lighter color, it can kind of get blended in. So I'll put a lot of white on my paintbrush and kind of dab it in there. And then if you have if this is for like water or snow, you want to put the color of the sky. Like, say this was a pond here. This is what you would do while you're painting the sky. You'd put that color into the water or snow. I'm going to wipe it off because I don't have that on mine. But that's how you would create water, because the water is reflecting the sky, or snow is reflecting the sky. So if you have any water in yours, paint it while you're painting the sky color, and make sure to get that sky color in there. And then you'll add some colors from the landscape around the water and the edges, to create darks and lights. Now I'm using a dry, kind of fluffy brush, and while this paint is wet, I'm going to soften up my edges. So I'm adding a little water because it started to dry a little bit, and I don't want to leave any of these hard edges because that gives a little too much detail. Softer blended edges can fade into the background a little bit better. So I'm just softening this up and creating, more cloud-like texture, but also pushing it backwards with this blending. So if you're not sure if you have stuff in the right place while you're blocking in, or if you need to get up and go do something else, and you're not sure where to leave off, just blend your edges, soften up your edges with a clean brush. You can add a little water to it if your paint started to dry, and just soften things up. That's all I'm doing here. And I'm using the brush strokes like in the general direction of what I want my clouds to look like, in those kind of like U shapes. So now I'm going to start working on blocking in the other parts of the painting. So I'm working from back to middle ground to foreground, and I'm working directly. So I'm adding the colors I want to have where I want them to be. So I'm creating some shadows with this like purple, blue, to create some cool tones with the shadow. And what I'm thinking about is the color of my sky and creating the very furthest back of the mountain that's furthest away. And I'm kind of testing the color there against the sky. So I want to differentiate it from the sky, but I do want it to be a cool tone because, as we know with atmospheric perspective, things get cooler and less saturated as they move in to the background more. So you can almost think of there being like layers of atmosphere between your view, between the foreground and what's in the background. So as things move further away from your eye, as things move back into the distance, there's more layers of atmosphere there. So you can even mix the color of the sky with the color of the mountains or the objects you're using. You can also do a glaze at the end, to unify the sky and the background. And that's quite literally a layer of atmosphere that you're creating with the glaze. I'm showing you how to do it directly to get that color down. And which you can do, I am exaggerating the color here and making it more gray so it pushes back more. So you can do that with atmospheric perspective. You know, sometimes with photography, it gets everything in the same focus, depending on your camera settings and stuff. So if you want in your painting to give it more depth, you can add less detail or take away detail in the background and add more of the color of the sky to the background elements like this mountain that I'm doing. So the mountain in the photo is sort of a bluish purpley, and I just like making mountains purple against a blue sky. I think that looks nice. So I mixed up like a purple gray. We can always edit it later, but I am thinking about getting the color I want down at this point. And then I'm thinking about my shadows that I'm going to start adding in. And since this is a fall scene, you know, I have the oranges, reds, yellows, and there's also these dark greens of the evergreen trees here and the trees that are still turning color. So I'm mixing up kind of a shadow shape with my phthalo green and ultramarine blue and some of that red to give it like a purple tone. Also, I'm adding white in to create a grayness. Now I'm starting with an orange, the yellow and red to create orange. And I painted the blue background because blue and orange are complementary colors, and I really wanted the oranges to pop against the background. So I'm also adding in some raw umber into here to kind of tone it down. So the further back that my trees are, the less detail and the less saturation they're going to have. So I'm not using the full vibrant orange or yellow in this layer here because I'm working from back to foreground. So this is like the middle ground here, but it's the back of the middle ground, right? It's still really far away. It's not as far away as the sky, but it's the furthest away, like earth part of my composition. So I'm still keeping it really loose, but I'm starting to add some more saturation and I'm starting to add more detail on these parts of the mountain range that are closer to my eye. And thinking about it in layers again and thinking about it in distance, in how far away it is from my eye. And I'm working across the whole composition. So I'm thinking about this entire section of distance, of this sort of middle ground distance that I'm creating. My paintbrush got maybe a little too wet, so I want to dry it off and fill it with color again. So I'm going to get some more of this orangey yellow tone without as much of the raw umber mixed in. So now it's going to be even more saturated as I get to this next closer level of my midground. So I'm adding more saturation and more detail as things get closer to our eye level, to the viewer. And I'm blocking in some of these trees that are really in the very middle ground that are going to have a little more definition. Just to give, you know, in these landscapes, sometimes the middle ground can kind of turn into one maybe not so interesting blob. And so creating some contrast in the values and the colors can create some interest and sort of break up that long sort of rectangle strip of middle ground of those mountains. So that's why I'm thinking right away about those shapes of the trees that I want to pop out in front of that mountain. And this is something that, you know, a place I've looked at a lot and I walk by all the time. So I'm familiar with it. So I am looking at the photo, but I'm also thinking about what it's like to be there in real life. And so that's what I hope you enjoy out of this too. So I'm picking up a new brush and I'm going to mix up some sort of dark green. So I'm taking the blue and the yellow to get a dark green to create a shadow tone to contrast all against this like orangey yellow that I've created, because sort of the trees are turning, so they're half green, half yellowy orange, and the greenish blue is going to serve as a contrast to create that interest, again, between the values and the color, that contrast between the values and color, that sort of break up this middle ground area. And I don't want to get too detailed. I'm not going to make as much detail as is in the photo. I'm just almost creating like a suggestion of these trees in the middle ground, because once you start adding more detail, it pulls it closer to your eye, and it can, the detail can be distracting. You want to save that distracting detail to the foreground stuff. Now, since I have this color on my brush, I'm getting in this tree that's like moving towards the foreground that we're going to see closer. So we're going to see a little more detail. And I'm just kind of creating dots of color for the leaves of this tree. You're not painting every single leaf, right? That would be very painstaking, and you could if you wanted to, but I'm really just kind of blobbing in the shapes. So I usually keep kind of two different brushes in my hand, and I switch from my left to right hand. So in my non-dominant hand, I just hold the brush. I'm not using, sometimes I'll have a jar next to me with it too. And one will have like more of the cool tone or a darker tone, and one will have a warm tone or the light. Just so it's sometimes easier to have two different brushes when you're working with lights and darks or warms and cools. So you don't have to clean it every time. It's just like a time saving thing to get if you're getting in the flow of painting. And, I'm just creating this almost like maroony, like maroon, dark red color to give some contrast in the warm tones. And now I'm going back to add the contrast for the cool tones. So I'm always thinking about contrast. I'm looking at my image and thinking about where the warms and cools are and the lights and darks are. So I'm getting these colors down as quickly as I can, and I'm kind of just dabbing them in. I'm kind of just like creating almost like little dots, short brush strokes with my brush, almost like little impressionist brush strokes, just to fill in the color, get things where I want them to be. And I need more yellow. Always gonna need more yellow and white because they get lost when you start mixing them. So if you have a lot of a light color like that in your painting, you can put a lot on your palette. So I made that long line of the yellow because some of the yellow will be used for the green, right? I'm mixing yellow and blue to get green, and some of the yellow will be used for the orange, where the yellow will be mixed with red. So right now I'm creating that green with the yellow and ultramarine blue, and I'm going to start adding in, and I'm putting a little phthalo green in with that too, which is a really strong color if you got the phthalo. So it can be awesome, but it can also kind of take over. So I'm adding more raw umber in there to kind of tone it down, but it gives some really nice effects, that phthalo green. And it's a color I used in the background, so I'm kind of like pulling that out in the shadows. And so I'm just darkening these shadow shapes and going across that sort of layer or section of my painting to get it in. And, we're working in layers of detail and layers of saturation. And, you have to let your painting be in these kind of messy stages. Like most of the painting process, you're not going to love the way the painting looks. You have to kind of let it be messy, let it be unfinished for a long time, and work on starting paintings and being okay with like the messiness of the process or the imperfection of the process. And I think that can be hard sometimes when you're not getting the results you want right away. But I always say just keep going, because if you watch any painter paint, they're starting off really sort of loose or with a drawing, and then they're blocking in these areas and working in like layers of detail. So I'm working on the bottom of where these sort of trees meet the field. This is like a big hay field. So I'm getting that like contrast because it gets really dark on the bottom of where these trees are all creating a shadow. So I want to make sure to kind of get that line in place. And then I'm adding that color into the shadows of my foreground. So when I have a color mixed up, like the way I did with the sky, if you were going to make some water, I'm using that as my shadow tones in the foreground to start unifying the painting using the same color. So while I have that dark tone mixed in, I'm creating my foreground shadows and I'm like refining where I want everything to be. And I'm always thinking about like the darkest and lightest parts of my painting. So like that shadow under the trees in the background and the shadow under the foreground tree are kind of the darkest. And here I'm just adding back in some of that yellow. I want some of these yellow trees to really pop. So I just got a bunch of yellow paint on my paintbrush and I'm sort of plopping it on there, dabbing it in, and then letting it mix in a little bit with the wet paint that's already there. And I really want to pull out some of these highlights, which is a thing you do more towards the end. You kind of block out these highlights and you're bringing your highlights back after you get kind of that whole section down. So I don't want to get too detailed here, but I do want to create some contrast and some interest. You know, I love the fall colors and I really want these to kind of pop in the midground, but not become too detailed that they're distracting or look like they're in the foreground. So I'm being really loose with my brush strokes and letting them kind of blend in. I have a lot of paint on my brush, and then as the paint is coming off my brush, I'm kind of blending it in a little bit more in the further distance to create some more contrast and interest with those trees. So there's no, I'm not doing it exactly. I'm also thinking about, I'm looking at the photo, but I'm also thinking about my painting and what's going to work with my painting. So I'm not copying the photo exactly. I'm thinking about what makes sense for my composition and how my painting looks and how I want it to look. So I'm just, bringing back some highlights here, creating that contrast in that sort of mid-range, mid-ground part of my painting. So starting with those darker tones and then finishing up with the lighter tones for that section. And then clean up your brushes whenever you need to. Whenever you're kind of switching colors, you can I clean my palette a lot too. It's always good to take breaks. These things take a long time, so make sure to get up and stretch if you need a stretch. And now I'm using a larger brush and I'm gonna start in on the field in the foreground, and I'm mixing more yellow into the green I created for the background. So I'm just getting lighter and more saturated as we move forward. So I'm just filling in this space and kind of since the paint is still wet on those trees in the background, letting it sort of mix in a little bit, so it doesn't seem like a separate section of the painting. So it seems like it's all unified. And I'm just, getting the right color, testing it, putting it on. And you can see with the background, phthalo green blue color, it is looking like kind of a funny color, but I think it's actually good for this painting because there's a lot of dead grass in here and the tall grass that's like turning yellow. So I think that is helping me, and I'm just putting a thin layer on here. I'm just getting paint down. I want to fill up my whole canvas in this blocking in part of the painting. Of course, I need more yellow. Always going to need more yellow in here. And I want to mix up some different greens, some dark and light greens to get that, get the colors I want down in the foreground. So take your time mixing up these colors and, spreading them out through the whole canvas. And if they're not exactly the way you want them to be, we are painting directly here. It's okay. You can always change them. So I think in this blocking in stage, it's just good to get paint down on your painting. It's good to block in the basic colors, the basic values that you want to have in your painting. I'm adding some more red here because I'm sort of exaggerating the saturation that's in the foreground of my painting, because remember, things in the foreground, to create that atmospheric perspective, things that are closest to you are going to be the most saturated, have the most detail, have the most contrast. So I'm really thinking about all the different colors I can add into this. And you can see I'm painting sort of lightly, sort of thinly over those shadows to create that really like overgrown grass look around this tree. And I'm just thinking about how I'm going to get some detail in here later, and how I'm like sort of setting myself up with this blocking in to paint some details over that later. And just adding a little more saturation. Like it got too yellow here, so I don't want to leave that too yellow. I don't want to let it dry like that. But again, if it's not the color you like, you're always going to be able to paint right over it. So just get blocked in with the colors that you want. Fill in the background, the middle ground, and a little bit of the foreground. No detail really at this stage. I probably did a little bit too much detail in those trees in the midground with that yellow, but can't help myself sometimes because those are fun to paint. And I wanted to paint in those yellow and orange highlights while the darker tones were still wet. So think about just filling in all of the sections of your canvas, working from background into the middle ground, and then get some of the foreground blocked in, but no details yet. I'm not really thinking about this tree that's the most in the foreground. I'm just thinking about what's around it. And as you can see, I'm like covering the edges of the tree so that then I'll paint the tree bark back over it. Adding a lot of saturation here in the foreground, and I'm bringing it up into the tree so I can then create detail over that. So I'm like setting myself up for the detail stage, but I'm not painting too much detail yet. And I'm just getting my darks and lights in, and setting myself up for success for the next stage of adjusting and refining that comes after the blocking in stage. All right, so have fun with this. I spent about half an hour on this stage. You could do yours much quicker. I tend to be a slower painter, and like I said, I probably did a little too much detail in this blocking in stage. But try to spend about 20 to 40 minutes on blocking in your entire composition. No detail. Have fun.